Welcome back to Planet Shmearth, where evolution moves slow and sarcasm moves fast. Hit subscribe if you're into bedtime science rants, and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. It started with a quiet escalation in body planning. Organisms that once relied on blobs, tubes, or lazy sheets began tinkering with segmented layouts. Why settle for one set of parts when you could just copy-paste them down the length of your body like mismatched clay beads on a string? Segments could specialize. One for feeding, one for defense, one just there for balance, or maybe to look intimidating depending on the lighting. Internal plumbing got an upgrade too. What used to be poke a hole somewhere and let water flow became an actual network of channels, loops, and gates. Circulation improved, nutrients got delivered faster, and waste got flushed out before it had time to fester. It was basically the biological equivalent of moving from a leaky bucket to a high-maintenance fountain system. Predators took the hint. Some evolved articulated limbs for grasping, bending, or pinning prey, their clay-textured joints flexing in unsettling, stop-motion-like jerks. Others refined their sensory systems, detecting vibrations, chemical cues, or the faint shadows of something foolish enough to wander into range. Hunting went from lunge at whatever is nearby to patiently stalk, then lunge at whatever is nearby. On the continental shelves, reefs became even more absurd. Tiers of living architecture rose like stacked amphitheaters, each level crammed with specialists squabbling over territory. Whole corridors formed from intertwined colonies, some bristling with spines, others slick with mucus so predators slid right past the good bits. From above, it looked like someone had dumped a bucket of clay models into a blender, then let the pieces harden in place. On land, mats took their time plotting the next advance. They began layering their communities vertically, building crust on crust, trapping moisture deep inside. From a distance, they resembled uneven tiles baked in the sun, until you stepped on one and it oozed to life. Floodwaters only helped them spread faster, peeling off strips of living crust and draping them over new rock like a damp, slightly hostile welcome mat. And in the open ocean, the real show was starting. Mobility wasn't just about speed anymore, it was about control. Organisms began steering, angling their bodies and timing their movements to exploit currents instead of fighting them. Suddenly, travel had purpose. It wasn't just go toward food, it was go toward the best food and get there before your neighbor. Which meant the quiet, stable phase was over. Because once competition got directional, the entire game changed, and Earth was more than happy to watch it spiral, preferably into something chaotic enough to entertain the next few 100 million years. Directional competition meant that food sources weren't just being grazed anymore, they were being raided. Predators began arriving in organized waves, swarming a reef face or a patch of plankton-rich water like clay-textured vultures. Prey had two options: leave early or stay and become part of the buffet. A surprising number still picked option 2. Those that didn't get eaten started hedging their bets with layered defenses. Shells thickened, spines grew sharper, and some bodies became walking sandpaper, turning every bite into an unpleasant mouthful. Others went the chemical route, producing toxins that not only made predators sick, but lingered in the food chain long enough to punish anything foolish enough to try twice. Reefs, now the most valuable real estate on the planet, became even more overcrowded. The spindly towers expanded upward, layered like tiered clay wedding cakes, each level a crowded street market of feeding arms, waving tentacles, and slow-moving grazers. Entire corridors turned into one-way death traps where prey could get in but not out without donating a few limbs to the locals. In open waters, the shapes got weirder. Long, ribbon-like swimmers unfurled themselves into broad sheets when threatened, confusing attackers with their sudden size. Others compacted into tight armored balls, drifting like clay marbles until danger passed. Some even evolved the ability to eject small sacrificial body parts, essentially throwing a piece of themselves to distract a predator before quietly scooting away. On land, mats began forming patchwork mosaics that stretched for meters at a time. They grew in strange, overlapping layers, trapping heat and moisture under their crusty exteriors. Occasionally, the outer shell would crack open, releasing puffs of spores into the wind like a cranky clay piñata. Those spores could drift for kilometers, colonizing entirely new patches of rock before the next storm hit, and the climate, because it refuses to just sit still, started warming again. Currents shifted, flooding nutrient-rich waters into places that hadn't seen much activity in ages. Bloom events returned in such force that entire stretches of coastline glowed with green and gold, as if Earth had redecorated for a party it forgot to invite anyone to. But beneath all that color, something subtler and far more dangerous was brewing. For the first time, movement, sensing, and predation were starting to link together in ways that looked uncomfortably like strategy, which, in Earth terms meant trial and error with a slightly higher success rate than usual. Some predators began herding prey into confined spaces, using coordinated sweeps of their bodies like slow, clay-textured brooms. Once cornered, the victims would either bolt in the wrong direction or freeze entirely, which worked out great for the hunters and terribly for the hunted. Others took to lying perfectly still along the seafloor, blending into the muck until an unsuspecting grazer floated by, at which point they'd spring up like a badly wound stop-motion puppet. Prey, for their part, weren't entirely helpless. Some began traveling in loose groups, the early prototypes of schools or herds. The idea wasn't so much mutual protection as, if something's going to get eaten, maybe it won't be me. Others developed startle tactics, sudden bursts of speed, flashes of pigment, or clouds of foul-smelling chemicals that made predators regret their career choices. Reefs became even more of a biological madhouse. Every nook and cranny hosted something that either wanted to eat you, poison you, or just shove you out of the way. Certain colonies built curtain-like growths over their entrances, turning their homes into slow-moving clay stage sets. Passing by one was like walking past a row of suspicious theater props. You knew something inside was waiting to grab you. Farther out in the open water, body shapes continued to diversify. Some creatures developed trailing streamers, possibly for display, possibly to lure in small prey, and definitely to give predators something to chew on that wasn't vital. Others expanded their sensory range, detecting disturbances in the water column from increasingly ridiculous distances, as if they'd grown paranoid and invested in an early warning system. On land, mats began showing a new trick: temporary vertical growth. During wetter seasons, they'd sprout short, finger-like projections covered in reproductive structures, releasing spores into the air like tiny clay fireworks. Once the rain stopped, the projections would wither away, collapsing back into the crust, leaving behind only a scattering of dust and resentment. Meanwhile, the climate decided it wasn't done playing games. Subtle shifts in ocean chemistry favored some blooms over others. leading to massive die-offs in certain areas and suffocating overproduction in others. The result was a patchwork of abundance and famine. Perfect conditions for testing which new survival strategies were genius and which were evolutionary comedy sketches. And somewhere in this chaos, the first faint outlines of truly specialized predators and prey began to emerge, roles that would soon define entire ecosystems, whether anyone liked it or not. And, spoiler alert, plenty didn't. Predators that once just grabbed whatever floated past were now honing in on specific targets. Some developed mouthparts shaped like precision tools, perfect for prying into shells or scraping food from reef crevices. Others opted for brute force attachments, suction-like grips that could clamp onto prey and refuse to let go, the clay-textured equivalent of a toddler latching onto your leg. Prey adapted in kind, but not always gracefully. Some armored up so heavily they could barely move, relying on the strategy of be too much work to bother with. Others went full evasion mode, perfecting erratic, zigzagging movements that looked like they were being piloted by someone who'd just learned steering existed. A few even evolved false appendages, extra flaps or dangling bits designed to be bitten off without killing them, which was noble in a please eat this decoy limb instead sort of way. The reefs themselves were practically groaning under the density of life. Every inch was claimed, defended, or contested. Long, curtain-like growths swayed in the currents, hiding tiny ambush predators inside. Overhangs were stacked with filter feeders that fanned the water like synchronized clay windmills, each convinced they were the most important organism in the neighborhood. In open waters, the diversity show just kept going. Some swimmers evolved fin-like extensions that acted as stabilizers, allowing sharper turns during chases. Others lengthened into whip-like forms, darting between prey and predator alike with irritating unpredictability. And then there were the ones that decided speed wasn't worth it at all. Giant drifting fortresses bristling with defensive spines, moving so slowly they might as well have been part of the scenery. On land, mats began to form interconnected networks across rocks and tidal flats. They linked through thin thread-like filaments, sharing nutrients and chemical signals like an early version of gossip. If one patch got stressed, too hot, too dry, too much competition, the others knew about it almost immediately, adjusting growth or sending out spores in a low-key territorial flex. And because Earth never misses the chance to stir the pot, another wave of tectonic restlessness began. Continents crept into new positions, altering currents and creating fresh coastlines for colonization. With every new stretch of shallow sea came another experimental playground, and with every playground came fresh disasters waiting to happen, because nothing on Earth gets to enjoy new real estate without something trying to kill it immediately. The newly formed coastlines were like open invitations for colonization. Mats surged in first, spreading across tidal flats in glossy clay-colored sheets that clung to every rock and crevice. They wasted no time forming layered crusts, trapping moisture and suffocating anything unfortunate enough to get buried underneath. From above, it looked like the planet was getting a bad patchy paving job. In the shallows, bloom events hit overdrive. Warm, nutrient-rich waters turned entire bays into thick, swirling soups of green and gold. Predators patrolled the edges like lazy security guards, picking off anything that strayed too far from the safety of the mass. Occasionally, storms would rip the mats apart, sending chunks drifting into open water where opportunists picked them clean like floating buffets. Reefs took the coastal expansion as an excuse to go bigger. New spires rose like crooked clay skyscrapers, bristling with spines and draped in waving fronds of filter feeders. Predators threaded themselves through the structures, turning sharp corners and ambushing prey from behind mucus-coated ledges. Scavengers swarmed the reef floor, feasting on scraps and each other with equal enthusiasm. In the open ocean, body plans kept getting stranger. Some swimmers evolved flexible, accordion-like segments that could compress for bursts of speed, then expand for gliding. Others developed long, trailing appendages tipped with stingers or sticky pads, perfect for snagging prey, or just tangling in a rival's face out of spite. A few even started mimicking harmless drifters, hiding their predatory parts until it was too late for the victim to do anything but regret their life choices. On land, the mat networks continued their quiet empire building. Interconnected colonies shared resources across wide areas, making them nearly impossible to wipe out without extreme conditions. Some began producing small, hardened nodules, portable packets of life that could roll or be carried by wind to colonize fresh surfaces. Think of them as the planet's first unsolicited spam deliveries. And above all this, Earth's climate started to twitch again. Currents shifted, winds changed, and subtle variations in temperature began to ripple across ecosystems. Nothing catastrophic yet, just the kind of small, steady changes that tend to snowball into something dramatic if left unsupervised. Which, given Earth's history, meant the snowball was already halfway down the hill, grinning and picking up speed. The temperature shifts nudged ocean currents into new, slightly inconvenient patterns. Some regions went from nutrient-rich buffets to barren, sparkling deserts in less than a few thousand years, which, for Earth, is basically overnight. Elsewhere, formerly quiet stretches of sea became bloom factories, churning out thick, clay-colored slicks that rolled and pulsed like the planet was trying to make bread dough out of algae. Predators adapted fast. The ones in nutrient-starved zones got leaner, sleeker, and more opportunistic, snatching at anything edible, even if it wasn't on the usual menu. Some took to scavenging full-time, lurking near the edges of decaying blooms and slurping up whatever floated free. Others migrated, drifting with the current like freeloaders catching a ride on nature's version of an intercity bus. Reefs, as usual, handled the changes with mixed success. Some collapsed entirely, their spindly clay towers crumbling into rubble fields that scavengers quickly turned into busy, chaotic strip malls. Others doubled down, reinforcing their structures with thicker mineral layers, creating fortresses so dense they looked like someone had overfired a ceramic castle. These reefs became safe havens for entire micro-communities, as long as you ignored the part where safe meant you're just not the first thing getting eaten. On land, the mats showed no sign of slowing their conquest. They sprawled across wider areas, creeping into crevices and building multi-layered crusts that could trap entire puddles for weeks. Some colonies even started producing pigments that shimmered faintly in sunlight, possibly to reduce heat stress, possibly just to flex on less fashionable mats. In the open water, body plans continued to get unnecessarily creative. Elongated swimmers grew ribbon-like fins that twisted and coiled in the current, doubling as both propulsion and a confusing visual deterrent. Compact grazers developed bizarre paddle-shaped limbs for maneuvering in tight spaces, looking like clay wind-up toys as they scuttled along reef walls. And the predators? They were already experimenting with group tactics, a bad sign for anything slower, smaller, or less organized. The ecosystem wasn't collapsing yet. It was just rearranging itself in the same way furniture rearranges during an earthquake. And deep in that slow-motion chaos, the groundwork for the next big evolutionary leap was quietly slotting into place like a Rube Goldberg machine built entirely out of mucus, teeth, and misplaced confidence. The first sign was movement getting smarter, not faster, smarter. Predators started shadowing prey from a distance, waiting for the perfect moment to strike instead of just lunging at the nearest edible blob like an idiot. Some even began driving prey toward obstacles, reefs, tangled mats, or other predators, turning the whole thing into a low-budget nature documentary filmed in clay stop motion. Prey weren't passive about it either. Some species started changing direction unpredictably, darting in zigzags that looked less like a getaway and more like they'd been badly animated on purpose. Others began clumping together into dense, spinning formations, early prototypes of schools, where the hope was that the predator would get confused and pick the wrong target. Sometimes that worked. Sometimes it just meant all of them got picked. Reefs leaned even harder into their role as both fortress and feeding ground. Their towers grew taller, their walls thicker, and their corridors more labyrinthine, packed with branching tunnels that twisted back on themselves. Inside, filter feeders pulsed like little clay fans. Predators prowled like lazy landlords, and scavengers picked through leftovers with the resigned air of creatures who knew they'd never get the good cuts. In open water, body plans were getting theatrical. Some swimmers flared their fins into wide, shimmering displays to startle predators, or possibly to impress mates, assuming anyone here cared about romance. Others flattened themselves into paper-thin sheets that could turn invisible from certain angles, vanishing into the light like clay cutouts held up to a lamp. And a few predators adopted their own camouflage tricks, mimicking harmless drifters right up until the moment they exploded into a cloud of teeth and grasping appendages. On land, Mats took the interconnected network idea and went full empire. They built overlapping territories with multiple capital patches, sending out chemical messages like an early postal service. If a nutrient-rich puddle formed somewhere, every connected mat seemed to know within hours, and soon the whole network would be quietly, inexorably creeping toward it. Meanwhile, Earth kept tinkering with the settings. Rain patterns shifted, salinity levels fluctuated, and the frequency of storms ticked upward, just enough to make everyone nervous. It wasn't extinction level yet, but you could feel the planet starting to lean in that direction, like it was winding up for a punch, and history suggested it wouldn't be a gentle tap. The first blows landed in the form of unpredictable climate lurches. Warm periods baked the shallows, drying out coastal mats until they curled at the edges like abandoned clay coasters. Cold snaps crept in without warning, icing over near-shore waters and locking reefs into slow-motion survival mode. Neither phase lasted long enough for anything to fully adapt, which was exactly the kind of chaotic neutral energy Earth thrived on. In the oceans, the winners of these whiplash conditions were the generalists. Creatures that could eat almost anything and live almost anywhere. Some grazers widened their diets from picky specialist menus to anything that fits in the mouth. Predators followed suit, targeting whatever wandered closest instead of holding out for their favorite prey. It wasn't elegant, but it kept them alive, which is all evolution ever really asks for. Reefs, though stressed, still found ways to get bigger. Towering spires leaned into bizarre shapes, curling into loops and overhangs like hand-molded clay arches. The labyrinth interiors became even more convoluted, with choke points and blind corners perfect for ambushes. From above, they looked less like natural structures and more like a set designer's fever dream. Farther offshore, swimming styles evolved to handle the instability. Some species developed quick burst propulsion, sudden explosive dashes powered by contracting body segments like clay bellows. Others relied on long, energy-efficient glides, letting currents carry them across huge distances. A few even alternated between the two, giving chase for a moment before drifting away like they'd suddenly lost interest. On land, the mat empires adapted in their usual stubborn fashion. When heat dried them out, they sealed themselves in hardened crusts, waiting months for rain to wake them. When storms returned, they spread quickly into every puddle and crack, rolling out fresh clay-colored carpets as if nothing had happened. Some even started producing faintly toxic compounds, discouraging grazers from scraping them clean during the lean months. But the real shift was subtler. Predators and prey alike were now refining their movements, senses, and defenses in ways that suggested long-term planning, or at least the illusion of it. It was no longer a world of purely random collisions and opportunistic bites. This was coordinated, calculated, and if you squinted, the faintest glimmer of organized ecosystems, which naturally meant Earth was just about ready to mess it all up again, because the one thing Earth enjoys more than fostering life is casually threatening to erase it. The first hint came in the currents. Slow, deep water flows that had been quietly cycling nutrients for millions of years started to falter, stalling in places and surging in others. In some regions, oxygen-starved dead zones formed, turning whole swathes of ocean into watery deserts where only the hardiest, most stubborn microbes bothered to stick around. Everywhere else, the nutrient dumps got too rich, triggering blooms so thick they looked like the planet had smeared itself with clay-textured frosting. These bloom-choked zones were a paradise for filter feeders, at least until the algae started rotting, sucking the oxygen out of the water and turning the party into a mass suffocation event. Predators that relied on speed fled first. The slower ones either learned to hold their breath longer than they'd ever planned or became part of the sediment layer. Reefs felt the chaos immediately. Some collapsed outright, their mineral spires crumbling like overbaked pottery. Others adapted by becoming denser, sealing their interiors against poor water conditions and turning themselves into living bunkers. Inside these fortresses, entire micro-ecosystems survived in dim, filtered light, completely cut off from the swirling mess outside. In the open ocean, body plans began splitting into two extremes. On one end, there were the sprinters, sleek, blade-shaped hunters built for hit-and-run feeding in unstable waters. On the other, the fortress creatures, slow, heavily armored drifters bristling with defensive spines, daring predators to waste their energy. The middle ground, mostly gone. On land, mats played their usual long game. If flooding came, they spread in great glossy sheets, claiming every flat surface before the water receded. If drought followed, they hunkered down into brittle crusts, locking in moisture like a clay jar sealed for storage. Some colonies even began layering toxins into these crusts, ensuring that anything trying to snack on them during hard times got a mouthful of regret. And yet, even in this turbulence, the arms race between movement, sensing, and survival didn't slow down. If anything, the constant environmental resets just sharpened the competition, forcing every species to become leaner, meaner, or sneakier. It was a world learning, very slowly and with lots of casualties, that thriving on Earth meant never assuming tomorrow would look anything like today. And, if it did, you'd probably just missed the warning signs. In the oceans, the survivors were starting to look like over-engineered clay figurines. Predators sported layered armor, jointed limbs, and enough sensory frills to pick up a sneeze from 50 meters away. Prey countered with speed bursts so sudden they looked like they'd been yanked by a stop-motion animator, or camouflage patterns that turned them into suspiciously rock-shaped blobs until they moved and ruined the illusion. Reefs became more like cities with zoning laws nobody respected. Spire tops were prime real estate for sun-hungry filter feeders, while shaded crevices swarmed with ambushers waiting for something unwary to drift by. Predators patrolled the outskirts like grumpy landlords, and scavengers darted in to clean up the inevitable mess, leaving trails of fine, clay-colored silt in their wake. Farther offshore, the fortress creatures got bigger. Some developed massive shield-like plates that overlapped like medieval armor. Others covered themselves in bristling spikes, turning their whole bodies into floating clay hedgehogs. They weren't fast, but when you're basically a mobile wall with a bad attitude, speed stops being a priority. On land, the Mat empires continued their creeping takeover. They linked themselves across wide tidal zones, so that a storm flooding one end could send a pulse of nutrients to colonies miles away. Some even began producing faint patterned ridges across their crusts, possibly to channel water more efficiently, possibly because even microbes enjoy redecorating once in a while. And above all this, the climate shifts kept pushing the system like a child testing the limits of a fragile toy. Temperatures flirted with the edge of habitability, storms hit with irritating irregularity, and ocean chemistry yo-yoed just enough to keep specialists on the verge of panic. Every species that made it through did so by becoming adaptable, aggressive, or, most successfully, annoyingly stubborn. It was evolution's version of a stress test, and Earth was just getting warmed up, which, in Earth terms, could mean pleasantly tropical, or hope you enjoy boiling alive, depending on the decade. The first sign of the next shake-up was a subtle but relentless creep in global temperatures. Currents shifted again, redrawing nutrient maps like a bored cartographer, and in some places upwellings delivered enough minerals to supercharge blooms into thick, clay-textured swaths that smothered everything in their path. In other regions, the party dried up entirely, leaving once bustling waters eerily clear and suspiciously quiet. Predators didn't take these changes lying down. The sleek hunters of the open ocean got leaner still, streamlining into living spears capable of darting through gaps in prey defenses. Others went the ambush route, hiding in silt under reef ledges or even inside abandoned shells like clay squatters, springing out only when something edible drifted past. Prey fought back with an alarming mix of creativity and desperation. Some bulked up, layering their shells until they resembled walking pottery kilns. Others turned evasive maneuvers into performance art, twisting, flipping, and darting with such erratic energy that predators sometimes just gave up out of sheer annoyance. A few got sneaky, mimicking the appearance of toxic or inedible species, which worked right up until the predator in question decided it didn't care. reefs expanded into the newly productive zones, their architecture growing even more absurd. Towers leaned, spiraled, and merged into overgrown clay fortresses with so many twists and chambers that entire predator species evolved just to navigate them. Inside, it was equal parts bustling market and war zone, with food, shelter, and safety constantly changing hands, or tentacles, or pseudopodia. On land, the mats took advantage of wetter cycles to push farther inland. They sprawled into shallow basins, building layer upon layer of crust until the ground itself felt soft underfoot, if anything on Earth at this point had feet. When the water retreated, they locked down into hardened, tile-like surfaces that cracked dramatically in the sun, only to swell back to life with the first rainfall. And as these worlds, reef, open water, and land, all hummed with new adaptations, the subtle signs of yet another looming change began stacking up. Storm tracks shifted farther south. Deep water currents began running colder, and the chemical balance of the oceans tipped ever so slightly towards something unfriendly. It was the kind of tension that made you wonder, was Earth about to test its new tenants, or was this just its way of rearranging the furniture again? Though, knowing Earth, rearranging the furniture usually meant setting it on fire first and then complaining about the smoke. The cooling deep water currents began flexing their influence, bleeding icy fingers into regions that had been comfortably temperate for millions of years. Some blooms fizzled almost overnight, their clay-colored slicks breaking apart into limp, drifting scraps. Elsewhere, cold water brought fresh nutrients that supercharged growth, turning coastlines into thick, undulating carpets of algae that looked like they'd been sculpted by an overzealous pottery class. Predators moved with the shifts, abandoning depleted zones and flooding into the new hotspots like opportunistic landlords chasing a housing boom. Fast, sleek hunters thrived in the open water sprints between feeding grounds, while ambushers staked claims near the edges of these new bloom zones, lurking in silt clouds and feigning innocence until lunch swam by. Prey adjusted in ways that ranged from clever to downright absurd. Some thickened their armor to the point of barely being able to move, relying on the be a rock strategy. Others evolved hypersensitive vibration detection, bolting at the first hint of trouble, which, unfortunately, meant they also bolted for harmless bubbles, drifting debris, and occasionally their own shadows. Reefs took the changing currents as an excuse to expand even further into previously unsuitable waters. The newer builds weren't just spires, they were sprawling, interlocked clay fortifications, complete with overhangs, tunnels, and dead-end corridors that served no purpose other than confusing anyone trying to navigate them. Inside, the usual mix of freeloaders, cleaners, and predators fought over every inch of prime space, the way they always had and always would. On land, the mat networks proved they were still the undisputed champions of stubbornness. They crept into seasonally flooded plains, spreading in thin, slick layers that trapped sediment like natural mortar. When the water receded, these layers hardened into cracked, dusty tiles, their dormant life sealed inside like a time capsule that no one had asked for. But the real story was the quiet shift happening everywhere at once. Specialization, movements were sharper, senses more precise, hunting and escape strategies more fine-tuned. For the first time, ecosystems weren't just reacting to chaos. They were actively shaping it, which, naturally, meant Earth was going to up the difficulty level any minute now. And it didn't disappoint. Temperatures began to swing like an indecisive pendulum. seesawing between warm pulses and abrupt chills. Shallow seas that had been prime feeding grounds one season could be barren, icy deserts the next. In some places, this created brief windows of absurd overproduction, mats and blooms expanding so fast they piled up into clay-textured ridges that looked like the planet had tried to ice a cake and given up halfway. In others, the shifts simply erased entire food webs, leaving behind silent, mineral-stained flats where only the truly desperate lingered. Predators leaned hard into mobility. Sleek, tapered bodies became even more streamlined, cutting through choppy waters like clay knives. Some evolved the ability to switch between sprinting bursts and energy-efficient glides mid-hunt, the marine equivalent of flooring it, then coasting past the speed trap. Ambushers took to roaming, abandoning fixed hunting spots in favor of patrolling vast territories like overconfident security guards. Prey doubled down on paranoia. Shells grew thicker, ridges sharper, pigments more chaotic. Some developed false eyes to make predators think they were being watched, a psychological defense that probably didn't work, but at least looked dramatic. Others clustered in mixed species groups, the early draft of safety in numbers, which mostly just meant predators had more menu options in one place. Reefs, as usual, played the long game. The most resilient structures thrived, forming tangled, overlapping complexes that turned entire coastlines into fortress warrens. Their interiors grew so convoluted that some inhabitants likely lived and died without ever seeing open water. From above, they resembled the ruins of a clay metropolis left behind by a civilization that built without blueprints. On land, the mat networks advanced into increasingly unpredictable territories. They took over floodplains, crusted over rocky outcrops, and even sent exploratory filaments into shallow brackish pools. When conditions went bad, they simply pulled back into hardened, cracked shells, storing energy like patient misers until the next opportunity. Through it all, one truth was becoming hard to miss. Life wasn't just surviving Earth's chaos anymore. It was starting to anticipate it. That was a dangerous skill to have on a planet that lived to pull the rug out from under you, and then set it on fire for good measure. The next rug pull started with a slow but undeniable cooling trend. Ice crept back into higher latitudes, not in a sudden cinematic sweep, but in the petty inch-by-inch way that lets you know it plans to stay. Seasonal ice reached farther down coastlines, boxing in shallow ecosystems and squeezing the range of warm water species like they were being herded toward the evolutionary exit. Bloom zones shrank and shifted, forcing filter feeders to either migrate or starve in place. Predators followed the food, abandoning long-held territories with all the loyalty of someone bailing on a losing sports team. In the open water, migrations became longer and riskier, with sleek, clay-toned hunters chasing prey across increasingly barren stretches like underfunded bounty hunters. Reefs split into two camps, the ice-tolerant fortresses and the doomed. The survivors grew squat and dense, minimizing surface area to withstand ice scouring, their walls reinforced with layer upon layer of mineral armor. From above, they looked less like vibrant coral-like structures and more like clay bunkers designed by someone who distrusted windows. Prey in these cold-edge ecosystems didn't have the luxury of style anymore. Body shapes became compact, minimizing exposed parts that could freeze or be bitten off. Color palettes dulled to muddy browns and grays, the clay-textured equivalent of blending into the wallpaper and hoping nobody notices you. On land, mats clung stubbornly to life in ice-free refugees. They survived winter by shrinking into thick, brittle crusts that cracked into geometric patterns across the rock. When meltwater returned, they burst back into slimy green carpets, covering every exposed surface as if nothing had happened. The botanical version of, "What? I've been here the whole time." And yet, even with the squeeze on resources, the predator-prey game didn't stall. If anything, it got sharper. Chases became more calculated, ambushes more precise, escapes more creative. It was as if the cold had trimmed away the dead weight, leaving only the most irritatingly efficient players on the field. Which, naturally, was Earth's cue to start cranking the thermostat the other way, because subtlety has never been Earth's strong suit. Ice retreated, seas swelled, and coastlines drowned under the slow, smug advance of warmer waters. The newly thawed shallows turned into nutrient factories, churning out blooms so dense they piled against each other in clay-textured waves, slapping the shore like over-enthusiastic bread dough. Filter feeders rejoiced, predators multiplied, and prey, well, prey just tried to stay out of everyone's mouth. In the open ocean, migrations shortened, hunting grounds expanded, and speed suddenly mattered again. Sleek predators sliced through warmer currents like sharpened clay knives, their movements honed from the leaner years of the cold. Some hunted in loose, opportunistic packs, corralling prey into panic-driven swirls before darting in for the kill. Others went solo, relying on stealth, patience, and the occasional reckless charge that somehow still worked. Prey took advantage of the bounty in their own way, mostly by producing even more prey. Populations exploded, bodies got a little bigger, shells grew a little thicker, and some even got fancy with patterns and pigments, as though stripes were going to make them less appetizing. Spoiler, they didn't. Reefs entered another architectural boom. Their towers stretched higher into the sunlit zone. Their corridors twisted into even more complex mazes, and their surfaces sprouted so many waving feeding structures that they looked like clay castles draped in wet streamers. Every crevice was claimed by something growing, something hunting, or something pretending to be neither until the right snack wandered by. On land, the mats surged inland with every seasonal flood, laying down glossy green-brown carpets over mud, sand, and stone alike. They spread so quickly after rains that from above, entire coastlines looked like they'd been glazed. When conditions dried, they hardened into cracking tiles, still alive beneath the surface, waiting for the next drink like seasoned desert con artists. But the most important shift was invisible, or at least hard to see unless you were paying attention. Interactions between species were getting tighter, more complex, and more dependent. Predators weren't just reacting to prey. They were anticipating them. Prey weren't just fleeing. They were baiting, distracting, and even leading predators into other predators. It was messy, it was unpredictable, and it was starting to look like strategy had officially become part of the game, which was exactly when Earth decided to change the rules again. Because if there's one thing Earth loves more than chaos, it's new chaos. This time, the shift came in the form of slow creeping chemical sabotage. Nutrient flows that had been steady for millions of years began to sputter. Some currents delivered too much, supercharging blooms into massive, clay-textured scum blankets that stretched for kilometers. Others starved entirely, leaving once crowded feeding grounds as empty and echoing as a forgotten shopping mall. Predators adapted with predictable ruthlessness. The sleek, high-speed hunters learned to roam farther, turning migration routes into sweeping arcs that covered entire basins. Ambushes became more versatile, able to lurk in both bloom zones and barren stretches, changing their hunting methods depending on the neighborhood's current vibe. In short, they stopped being picky, which is always bad news for anything edible. Prey didn't take this lying down, unless of course they were pretending to be dead, which actually worked for a surprising number of species. Some doubled down on camouflage, blending into the clay-colored muck so convincingly that even the water forgot they were there. Others formed mixed-species alliances, traveling in chaotic herds where no predator could be sure which target was worth the energy. A few developed quick-burst propulsion so violent they shot themselves several body lengths away, which was impressive until they smacked into a reef wall. Speaking of reefs, the survivors of the nutrient chaos became architectural fortresses. The outer walls thickened into jagged layered barricades while interior chambers narrowed into tight choke points that funneled predators straight into waiting ambushes. From above, they resembled clay mazes built by a paranoid artist with too much time and too little trust. On land, mats remained unbothered in their slow-motion expansion. They thickened their crusts, layered their pigments, and continued colonizing every puddle, floodplain, and damp crack within reach. When conditions soured, they simply pulled back into dormant mode, a smug, crusty stillness that said, "Wake us when the rest of you figure it out." And through all this, one thing became clear. Ecosystems were no longer just reacting to Earth's mood swings. They were adapting to anticipate the next round of nonsense, building resilience into every move. Which naturally meant Earth was already working on making that resilience useless. Because if there's one thing Earth can't stand, it's seeing anyone get comfortable. The sabotage this time came wrapped in climate theatrics. Long, lazy, warm spells lulled ecosystems into thinking they had figured things out. Predators and prey alike expanded their ranges, reefs grew taller and more elaborate, and mats spread inland with the smug confidence of a squatter who knows the landlord's out of town. And then, without warning, came the cold. Not the put on a jacket kind of cold. The half the coastline just froze solid and the rest is thinking about it kind of cold. Shallows locked under seasonal ice, open water productivity nosedived, and migration routes turned into gauntlets of empty, icy miles. The fancy specialized predators who had gotten too used to easy pickings were suddenly out of luck, replaced at the top by the adaptable generalists they'd been ignoring. Prey shrank back into defensive mode. Armor thickened, movement slowed, and coloration faded into the same dreary palette as the clay-colored silt. Some resorted to hibernation, sealing themselves away in mud or reef crevices until things warmed up again. Others didn't make it that far, becoming convenient snacks for the few predators still thriving in the freeze. Reefs suffered in predictable fashion. The sprawling, delicate towers of the warm years collapsed under ice scour, leaving behind stumpy, battered remnants. The survivors compacted themselves into squat, blocky fortresses with narrow entrances and low ceilings, the architectural equivalent of hunkering down and muttering, "This is fine." On land, mats tightened their grip on any ice-free refuges. They darkened their pigments to soak up what little sunlight was available, hardened their crusts against frost damage, and, because they could, sent spores skittering across frozen ground to wait for better days. It was a level of patience most animals could only dream of, and it infuriated anything that had to keep moving to survive. The cold didn't last forever. It never does. But by the time the warmth returned, the reset had been thorough. Entire lineages were gone, replaced by opportunists ready to claim the empty niches. And just like that, Earth had a whole new cast of characters to torment. And it wasted no time getting started. The first act of the new warm era was a full-on Bloom Arms race. Nutrient-rich runoff from freshly thawed landscapes poured into the seas, feeding explosions of algae so dense they turned coastlines into thick clay-textured soup. Filter feeders gorged themselves, predators swarmed in after them, and prey multiplied as fast as it could before getting eaten. The whole thing felt less like an ecosystem and more like an all-you-can-eat buffet with no fire code. In the open ocean, hunters regained their swagger. Sleek, fin-bladed bodies sliced through the water in coordinated strikes, some even driving prey toward other predators like they'd rehearsed it. Ambushers staked out the edges of bloom zones, using the thick water as cover before bursting through like clay torpedoes. Every strike sent up clouds of silt and shredded algae, leaving behind murky chaos for the next opportunist to exploit. Prey got bolder too, at least for about 5 minutes. Some developed quick dart and hide routines, using reef shadows to vanish between feeding bouts. Others formed massive, swirling schools that looked impressive until a predator punched through them, scattering bodies in all directions. A few even flaunted bright pigments, possibly to warn predators, possibly to flex, but either way, they still ended up in someone else's stomach. Reefs took the nutrient surge as a challenge and responded with a construction boom. Towers shot upward, ledges grew wider, and new labyrinth passages twisted through the interior like someone had decided the ocean needed more dead ends. From above, they looked like clay fortresses mid-renovation, half-finished in some places, overbuilt in others. Every surface was alive with feeding structures, waving fronds, and opportunists looking for their next move. On land, mats stretched into every newly wet patch of earth, laying down glossy green-brown veneers over mud, sand, and even rock. Floods carried fragments miles away, seeding new colonies that hardened into cracked crusts when the water pulled back. If you could hear them, they'd probably be saying, "We live here now, deal with it." And as the food webs fattened, so did the complexity. Predators began targeting specific prey more consistently. Prey responded with tailored defenses, and a few bold opportunists figured out how to exploit both sides. It was messy, competitive, and, worst of all, starting to work a little too well. Which, of course, meant Earth was already preparing the next shakeup, because on Earth, stability is just the prelude to betrayal. The signs arrived slowly, tucked into the background like the first suspicious creaks in a house you know is about to collapse. Currents shifted, again because apparently they're allergic to consistency. Some regions that had been drowning in nutrients suddenly went quiet, their once bloated blooms breaking apart into thin, drifting scraps. Elsewhere, upwellings doubled their output, flooding the shallows with so much plankton that the water turned into a pulsing, clay-colored haze. Predators adapted like they always did by becoming bigger headaches. The fast hunters pushed deeper into the new nutrient zones, timing their chases to intersect with migrating prey schools. Some began herding prey into tight, panicked knots before slicing through them like a knife through soft clay. Ambushers started working the barren zones instead, lying in wait along the few remaining feeding corridors, where desperate prey had no choice but to pass. Prey countered with a mix of brilliance and bad ideas. Some doubled down on armor, growing shells so thick they became slow-moving lumps of ceramic misery. Others took the opposite route, ditching bulk entirely in favor of twitchy, erratic movements that made them impossible to track, unless they exhausted themselves first and floated right into a predator's mouth. A few tried traveling in mismatched groups, figuring predators wouldn't know which species to chase. Spoiler, predators chased all of them. Reefs, meanwhile, started to look like architectural fever dreams. Their structures twisted into tighter spirals, riddled with dead-end tunnels and false openings designed to waste an intruder's time. The outer surfaces bristled with spines, stingers, and filter feeders all jostling for space like clay figurines glued together by a child with no sense of proportion. On land, mats continued their reign of quiet tyranny. They expanded into brackish zones tolerating salinity shifts that knocked other species flat. During droughts, they sealed themselves under layered crusts that looked like cracked pottery, only to erupt into full, slick coverage the moment rains returned. They didn't just survive the changes, they used them to colonize new territory faster than ever. And in every corner of the planet, one unsettling pattern emerged. The survivors weren't just the fastest or the toughest anymore. They were the ones that could change their tactics mid-game, which meant the arms race had officially entered a new, nastier phase. The kind where adapt or die stopped being a catchy motto and started being the daily reality show everyone was forced to participate in. In the oceans, predators weren't just hunting anymore, they were problem-solving. Some began shadowing specific prey species for days, learning their escape routes and ambush-proof zones. Others coordinated with members of their own kind, loose, temporary alliances, where the only rule was eat first, ask questions never. It wasn't teamwork so much as mutually beneficial treachery. Prey naturally upgraded their countermeasures. Camouflage became dynamic, colors and patterns shifting in real time to match shifting light or the mottled textures of clay reefs. Some adopted fake threat displays, flashing bold patterns or puffing up into improbable shapes in the hope of convincing predators they were dangerous or just not worth the trouble. A few took the more nihilistic route, darting toward predators to startle them, then slipping away while the hunter processed the audacity. Reefs, in the meantime, had gone from crowded to overbooked. Their spirals and ledges were so packed that entire sections became temporary no-go zones due to the sheer density of claws, spines, and stingers. Predators learned to lurk just outside these choke points, waiting for some unlucky resident to get shoved out like clay debris from an overstuffed mold. In the open water, the middle ground species, neither heavily armored nor lightning fast, were vanishing. You were either a tank or a ghost now, and anything in between was just a free sample. Some of the fastest hunters developed body shapes so refined they could cut through turbulent currents without losing speed, their movements smooth and unnerving, like someone had greased a clay sculpture and thrown it into a current. On land, mats continued their slow, inevitable takeover. They began layering themselves in mixed textures, slick upper layers to repel grazers, rough underlayers to hold water and sediment. Some even started producing faint halos of toxic compounds, creating dead zones around their edges like living no parking signs. And when the rains came, these mats expanded with an arrogance that suggested they knew nothing could stop them. Earth, of course, looked at all this increasing competence and decided it was time to make the next shake-up personal. The kind of personal where Earth stopped feeling like a passive backdrop and started acting like it had a personal grudge. It began with the tides. Not the pleasant, predictable kind that quietly lap at the shore, but a moody, inconsistent mess driven by tectonic twitchiness and the moon's relentless meddling. Shallow seas, the ones life had been counting on, were suddenly draining bare for days at a time, turning nurseries into frying pans. Elsewhere, once dry tidal flats spent weeks underwater, smothered beneath blooms so dense and slow-moving they looked like clay-colored syrup trying to make an escape. Predators swooped in on the chaos like it was a clearance sale. Some specialized in low-tide raids, sliding into stranded pools to pick off the doomed with almost bored efficiency. Others owned the flooded zones, drifting in the green haze, their silhouettes just clear enough to make prey regret leaving the reef. Prey tried every trick in the book, plus a few that probably should have stayed in draft form. Shell-bearers bulked up into walking pots, their armor thick enough to endure heat and teeth alike, but slow enough to make dodging a suggestion, not a strategy. Faster swimmers learned the art of precision timing, darting in and out of feeding grounds like thieves on a stopwatch. And then there were the sand burrowers, smugly hidden, until something learned to dig. Reefs adjusted by abandoning their vanity projects. The lofty, sun-catching towers that once scraped the surface were now liabilities, bleached, battered, and easily broken. Construction shifted downward, fortifying the base in tight, overlapping mineral slabs, like clay walls built by a fortress architect who'd decided light and air were overrated. On land, mats treated the shifting shoreline like a personal invitation. Every flood was a chance to invade inland, painting the ground in slick, glossy layers that dried into cracked ceramic once the water pulled back. The moment conditions flipped, they rehydrated and surged forward again, as if they'd just been lying in wait beneath the crust. Territories shifted. Old rivals found themselves forced into awkward proximity. Predators experimented with new prey, prey invented new ways to be difficult, and the whole system felt less like an ecosystem and more like a high-stakes game of musical chairs with teeth. And somewhere in the middle of it, quiet changes were beginning. Not the obvious kind. No grand catastrophes, no sudden explosions of life. Just small, persistent shifts in body plans, behavior, and ambition. The kind that would matter far more in the next chapter than anyone here could possibly imagine. Because the next upheaval wasn't going to just shuffle the pieces. It was going to redraw the whole board in clay.